this. It's really striking data. If you combine the kids that are improving over time here and that have stable, low internalizing symptoms, it's just one domain, but an important one in the work we're doing, a large proportion of the kids recovering child soldiers are doing quite well after some time goes by. That doesn't mean life is always great, but not everybody is. Some are deteriorating, some have lots of symptoms and stay there. She's now following these young people as they grow older and have children of their own, and is doing epigenetic genomic studies, I understand. Another example from the Katrina and Deepwater Horizon oil spill, a lot of the same kids and families who experienced Katrina and that devastation, they hadn't barely recovered, and then the oil spill hit as another traumatic thing. These are, again, looking at growth trajectories over time, in this case for PTSD symptoms, and you see some of these different patterns. This kind of work is beginning to put some empirical data to these theorized models of trajectories in the resilience and adaptive modeling fields. Another very important idea in the resilience work is cascades. And we've actually heard quite a bit about cascades, again, over the past day and a half. The cascades refer to this phenomenon that affects, when you have dynamic interacting systems, effects can spread from one system to another, from one level to another, or if we've been hearing about here, epigenetically and in other ways from one generation to the next. And people, this is just a picture of a typical structural equation model looking for cascades. There's lots of cascade examples out there, a burgeoning literature. Dante Cicchetti and I edited 2 special issues of the journal Development and Psychopathology back in 2010 that has some very interesting examples. And then there's all kinds of publications since then looking at cascades. One relevant example to what we're talking about here would be Phil Fisher's effort to generate a cascade in the biology of a child to try to intervene with the quality of parenting in foster care homes for children to try to correct their circadian cortisol patterns, to normalize them. So he did this, it's a randomized controlled trial. They helped the foster parents improve their quality of their parenting in the foster care home, and it had an impact at the biological level on the children. That's a cascade from family system into the biology of a child. Another example is interesting work being done by Huseman, Boxer et al. Here on community violence, and the key question of whether violence exposure at a community level, which is common, of course, in war zones and political conflict, and also very important in places like Chicago in the United States, does this community violence spill over into the microsystems of the lives of young people and then alter their own propensity for violence? And their work shows a clear directional effect from the macro violence level into families and schools and peer groups, and it alters the peer-on-peer violence in these communities. A very powerful and interesting study. Now, there are many examples, and I'll just mention one more. But I want you to think about, what have we heard here that represents a cascade, either from a higher level into the child, like biological embedding is a cascade model, or the reverse. If you can change something chemically, neurotransmitters chemically, we expect them to cascade upward into behavior and social interaction. Intervention effects clearly show cascade effects spreading from one domain to another. So this example of Jerry Patterson's work in trying to teach parents how to be better at their job in order to improve behavior problems in kids had interesting cascade effects over time, spreading to many other domains, including the economic well-being of the parent. Here's a few other influential models I want to highlight. These 2 are classic models looking at risk and assets. There's a main effects model, sort of if you have lots of risk factors, you can try to counterbalance that with resources or other kinds of compensatory effects. Intervention can be construed as a main effect model. But here, it's not risk dependent. These are all kind of independent from each other. In contrast, the model on the right side shows interaction effects. Again, these are classic. The risk-activated model is typical, based in many ways in the resilience literature on the concept of the way our immune system works. It's activated by threat, infectious agent detected, immune system goes into gear and tries to protect the organism. We inoculate kids in order to boost up this system. But emergency services for children also operate as risk-moderated protective factors. The idea of child protection, some sort of threat is detected to the child, and you have a system in place to try to prevent further harm or help that child and improve the outcome. There are also independent moderators that are independent of risk. These are moderators, they might be in the child or in somewhere else, in relationships, that are just there. Might be your personality, might be your epigenetic profile, whatever it is, but it alters the way in which a threat or risk of some kind has an impact on your adaptive functioning. And you may just be a mellow person, and that may alter the impact of adversity on your functioning. I think one of the most interesting emerging models that came out in recent years in the resilience field has been the context-dependent moderator models. And we've heard a lot about that here too. Differential susceptibility or differential sensitivity. These are moderators that actually work in a different way depending on the context. And here, so you have the differential susceptibility one there. I was trying to balance my friends who are in biological sensitivity and the ones on differential susceptibility. If you have adversity, you're more sensitive to that experience, so it has a bad outcome. If you have an advantage or an intervention that's represented here by advantage, you are more sensitive to that as well, and it helps you in a positive way. And then Michael Plus emphasized that, sometimes you may just have a moderator that only works under advantage or under intervention, and I would call that advantage sensitivity moderator in honor of Michael Plus. So there's been all this research, and I couldn't possibly summarize it. It's been criticized, the research on resilience, partly because there's a lot of inconsistencies related to the choices investigators make about what they're measuring and how they're defining adaptive function. But the reality is that there's also a lot of different kinds of adversity out there in the world. And despite all this variation in research, there has been some consistency in findings. There's been some inconsistencies as well, but there are some striking correlates of doing well in adversity. And this was mentioned before here. I called these the short list. They're not on a stone tablet or anything, and people sometimes propose different ones. But these are commonly associated with better outcomes in kids and young people all over the world in very different kinds of situations. Some are more important at some ages. Like for 2-month-olds, belief life has meaning is not a relevant protective factor. But it becomes very important later on. And some of these, may operate at many different levels. I mean, there are extensive bodies of work on these kind of ingredients for risk and resilience. I think what the short list really means is that there's some fundamental adaptive systems that I think are probably the product of both biological and cultural evolution or coevolution, and these systems provide a tremendous amount of capacity for resilience to members of our species. And they operate differently, maybe in different parts of the world and cultures, and certainly they are different at different periods in human history. And I think that, I won't say any more about that because we'll probably be talking about it some. But children, I wanted to make the final part of this about the fact that children never could wait on science. And the field of resilience science globally was motivated, the pioneers were motivated by an interest in helping children. It's not a coincidence that they were psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and educators. They were very concerned about high-risk children. And what was important about the pioneers, they recognized that we have neglected a very important aspect of variation in all of our work on risk. We need to understand how is it that some people do well, because that may provide us with important clues and information about what we need to do in order to promote resilience in children when it is not naturally occurring. So as the waves of resilient science were unfolding, a resilience framework for thinking about intervention and implementing intervention was also unfolding at the same time. And people just recognized that you can't, children can't wait, so you have to act on the best evidence you have. And I won't talk about all the aspects of this framework, but I think that the interest in science on resilience has had a profoundly transformative effect on interventions in many different areas, ranging from school counseling to psychiatry. There's much more focus now on positive ingredients, on strength-based approaches, and different kinds of strategies. And I just wanted to say one more thing about the strategies. The resilience literature suggests there's 3 major strategies for positive change. And one is risk-focused. Think about resilience doesn't mean you ignore risk. One of the most powerful things you can do for children is to reduce or eliminate risks like maltreatment or homelessness, or to mitigate that kind of risk. It's important to think about risk. But you can also think about boosting assets and resources, or mobilizing the most powerful protective adaptive systems we know of for human development. If a child loses their caregivers in a disaster, it is imperative that quality care be restored. That is the most important protective factor for a young child. We are also learning that windows of opportunity matter, and we've heard about that here too. When is change more possible? We need to know much more about this. It's not the same over the life course. And there are different windows of opportunity. Some are developmental. There are periods of development when plasticity seems to be surging. But there are also other times when conditions converge from change. And some of them are triggered by adversity itself. And some arise when people seek help and so forth. And maybe we can talk more about that. And I'll spend my last few minutes with just a quick example, just to illustrate kind of how do you step back and think about this in a particular context. I showed you the achievement problems of kids who experience homelessness and high mobility. Homelessness is a marker of risk. It's correlated with many other risk factors. But let's say I want to do something about that achievement gap. How would I think about it? We're doing that in working collaboratively. I work with a lot of wonderful collaborators who study all kinds of things, from biological to executive function to collaborators in the community who are crucial for trying to help these kids. One of the things we've done is try to identify key targets of change. We want targets that are influential for child development, but that are measurable and malleable. Malleable is really important. And we focused, for example, on parenting, executive function skills, and stress. And I'm going to have to skip through a few slides quickly. I'll just make the point that one of the things we faced right away was that a lot of our measures weren't developed for working in the field with very high-risk children. We've had to validate many of our measures, ranging from executive function to parent measures to stress measures, to work out protocols for how to collect data in the field with very stressed families. And that's been very important, and the families have helped us because they also are very interested in us understanding these things. We've validated biological measures, been able to collect. Our latest one venture is salivary RNA. We have done parent-child observational coding. We've validated the 5-minute speech sample. We've tried different methods for capturing the quality of parenting in the context of very high-risk situations. We do find that fancy measures with state space grid coding of parenting quality do seem to capture something important about how parents are doing right now, and that relates to the trauma symptoms of their kids, and it appears to function as a moderator. Good parenting quality in the middle of a shelter does moderate the trauma symptoms we see in the kids. We also have looked a lot at executive function because it's very implicated in many studies of resilience. We've heard that it's related to toxic stress. It's related to good parenting. It develops rapidly in preschoolers. There's a high plasticity window, and it shows promising malleability. So we've been very interested in trying to develop strategies to promote these kinds of skills in young children. In this case, from a measurement point of view, we've worked on improving the NIH toolbox measures of executive function, and our developmental extensions are being embedded into the new iPad versions of these flanker and DCCS tasks as we speak. We find that these skills predict school success, and they're related to current salivary cortisol levels in ways you would expect. And we've been working on interventions that are targeted at executive function, but timed to give kids a little bit of a boost in these self-regulation kinds of skills right before they go to school. Here's one of our little graduates. All the pictures of children have permission to show you, so you can learn about what we do. And this is a typical intervention sort of model. And it's a multiple component intervention. We've had tremendous help from teachers, from parents, and from executive function experts to try to develop an intervention, and we're still testing it out. We're also going to try to measure change at multiple levels of analysis. So we've got data validating these different measures. Are we changing what we're trying to change? And we're aiming to be theory informed but very practical. We partner with the community because we want what we're developing to work and be easy to implement in the community. Let me just highlight a few emerging issues. I have this time, if that's okay. A few more. These are just things for you to think about. Is resilience a trait? I told you I argue no, but I think we have interesting new forms of this issue coming up with biomarkers and endophenotypes. Is there a price of resilience? Or should that be construed as the price of adversity? Or is it possible that sometimes positive achievements actually exact a cost because it requires so much effort? And then we have this interesting new variation where at different levels, you could look good on the outside at school, but still show allostatic load on the inside of the organism. It's a very interesting question. Is there a time limit on resilience? And George has written a really powerful article on that, and there are commentaries, including mine, that you can take a look at. And this is very important as well. Does experience with adversity help or hinder our capacity to adapt? We do not understand all these issues. When do we see stealing effects of adversity, and when do we see sensitization effects? Or inoculation effects versus kindling effects? There are many nonlinear possibilities, and the evidence to date is looking very nonlinear. Most of the adaptive systems in human development require some experience to calibrate, and they also require some stress or challenge in order to work properly, just like your immune system does. We're in the midst of New Horizon discussions in this group. Certainly the neurobiology of resilience is an important horizon, but so are efforts to try to capture how individual resilience is linked to family resilience, cultural resilience, and community resilience. And there's tremendous global interest now in these sorts of things. I think sensitivity to context has had a transformative effect on the way we think about interventions in particular, and resilience, and a powerful reminder that context and function matter. Adaptive calibration, we're going to hear about a lot in just a few moments. You know, adaptive systems clearly show programming from experience. Can we reprogram, recalibrate? Can we reverse harmful changes? And I'll close here with my kind of take-home messages I see from the resilience field. First of all, resilience is common, and that's important to keep in mind. There's many roads to resilience. There's many ways to get there. Ordinary adaptive systems like good parents, those high-licking mom equivalents, are powerful. Resilience can be supported and promoted, and the resilience of kids depends on the resilience of relationships and systems around them. And also, I think the world is beginning to wake up a little bit to the fact that global resilience depends on the resilience of kids. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to take one question because we're going to have 15 minutes after the end of this session and then another 45 minutes after that. But let's take one question while George walks up here. Sandy. No burning questions? Okay, then we'll wait till the end of the session. So George, while he's running up here, I'm just going to say one thing. I have had the distinct privilege of watching George's career grow for about 20 years. He is one of the most creative people I've ever met in so many domains. But I hold the greater privilege of being able to be George's friend for 20 years. And so thank you for coming. Nobody gets introductions because we're saving time.
I have no idea how to do this.
Okay, you start talking.
Okay, I need a microphone. Is it on? Hello? Hello?
It's on.
I am not a child development researcher, and this has been an enormously humbling experience. I can't imagine a more enlightening meeting to attend. So thank you, Jenny, for inviting me. Thank you all for doing this. Okay. So I study primarily adults. I have done some research on children. I think some of this might be integrative. I'm hoping at least some of this is integrative. I'm hoping that it's useful in that way. Let's see, how do I advance the slides?
Just add the down arrow.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about two different streams of work. Let's see if I have a way to time myself. Okay.
I'll keep you on track.
Okay. So the first bit of work will be on resilience, but also on trajectories of adjustment. And I'm using the word heterogeneity a lot now because really outcomes following adverse events are heterogeneous. And I've been trying for a long time to try to understand that. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of trajectories Anne presented. And I've spoke on the same platform with Anne Masten a number of times, which is also a humbling experience. And we don't agree on every single point, which has been enormously stimulating for me, and it's really helped me think about things and about some really hard problems. So the other bit I'll talk about will be flexibility. And this is what a lot of the work we're doing now is on flexibility, and both as a moderator for life adversity and also possibly a source to maybe integrate and explain some of the kind of things we've talked about earlier today, where there are deficits but also strengths, and how do we make sense of those? So first the question is, what is resilience? So some of these slides I borrowed from a talk I just gave at NIH, where I was asked to kind of approach this question. And there's so many different ways people talk about resilience, and I find it a little frustrating when you hear the phrase, well, there are many definitions, as if they're all equal. But people talk about them in different ways. The development and maintenance of healthy adaptation. Some people talk about resilience as a trait, cluster of capacities and multidimensional systems, and just presented a very compelling systems model. And I often talk about resilience as a positive outcome for adversity. So which one